There was a feeling of excitement and anticipation among the tour group as they gathered on a ridge overlooking the Chinese granite walls near Granite, Oregon. In the late 1800s, more than 2,400 Chinese toiled in the mines of eastern Oregon. Guy Martin, a Forest Service archaeologist for the Wallowa Whitman National Forest, explained how the walls were created by the Chinese miners.
Okay, what they needed to do was get the larger rocks out of the way so they could get to the fine material, to where the gold was. So they would take the rocks and pile them into a wall, and then move, throw other rocks behind them, and it basically build a series of retaining walls. And they're in rows. This area that's right behind down here, just at the base of the road slope down here, is a series of small parallel walls, and it's row upon row upon row.
Hundreds of thousands of rocks, many weighing over 100 pounds, were stacked in rows 10 feet or higher, stretching out over a quarter mile. This site was excavated by the Forest Service's Passport in Time program with the help of the University of Idaho and numerous volunteers. Boise, Idaho once had a Chinatown, but the structures that once made up the community were torn down to make way for redevelopment. Fortunately, many artifacts and records were saved by the Idaho Historical Society and are now on display at the Idaho State Museum.
And we also talk about some of the laws that were enacted, or at least I should say, that were tried to be enacted in the anti-Asian fever of the 1880s and 1890s. And Idaho was one of the few western states whose Supreme Court didn't go along with it. And we probably had the most liberal anti-Asian laws.
In 1870, there were 4,200 Chinese in the Idaho Territory. Today in Boise, the state capital, the number of Chinese has dwindled to fewer than 150.
This is the railroad grade here.
The last stop of the Chinese Heritage Tour brings the group to the Granite Creek Trailhead in Idaho.
What we intend to do here is set up a spot at the top of this knob so we can interpret what you're seeing from there down and a little bit about these artifacts. When you look through here, what you'll see are the sort of components of this sort of field camp situation. We've got a bunch of cans that I'm pretty sure are T10s.
The ponderosa pine trees here are 75 years old. When the last Chinese miners were here, stacking the rocks to clear the land for placer mining, these trees were yet to be born.
Anybody yet, but that's the supposition. The small hot wheel rubber boot parts.
The legacy of the Chinese, who came over a century ago, has not completely vanished from the places where they worked and lived.
Well, the trip was important for me because it really lets you go to the sites and see, get some sense of the conditions in which the early Chinese American pioneers had to live, and it just gives you a renewed respect and admiration for how tough they were, how resourceful they were, and the conditions in which they had to endure to survive.
And I surprised that every stick got Chinese gold. We're digging for gold. I didn't know that, like that Great Wall, those Grand Wall, that surprised me.
It was a real eye-opener to see that there were many people from France and Belgium and Italy and other places who were doing mining, and the Chinese actually were the predominant ethnic group in that area. So to say that there were Americans and Chinese, or that there were somehow Chinese who were foreigners, and then the other people were somehow citizens, was simply not true, because the French and the Irish and the Italians were not citizens either.
Travel to all these sites and see them from the perspective of Chinese Americans. I guess I've become sort of inured to a lot of the interpretation that's more racially biased and pretty insensitive. So it's an awakening in that regard, just how much there is.
I think it's enlightened a lot of people. With me, it's added more information. I'm very fortunate that I grew up with that, and so there was always information there.
You know, my kids, they're so Americanized. You know, they hardly speak any Chinese. And Serena spoke to most of all my three daughters. And I wish that the other two could have come, because I think they would have learned a lot and appreciate their Chinese heritage even more.
Some of the Chinese Americans on this trip have noted that they had no contact with their past history and no knowledge of it, and there are Euro-Americans on the trip who have studied it from an academic or historical sense, but have no cultural tie with it. So again, that variety has been really interesting to me. But it's been a rich human experience because of that historical and variety and experience and culture.
So I came knowing a little bit about my history, knowing a little bit about Chinese American history, knowing that they did mining and that they had worked on the railroads, but not having a real tangible concept of what that was. And so when we were first driving down here along the Columbia, I was looking at the railroad tracks and I was trying to imagine in my mind, well, what was it like for those people working there in Michigan and along the river, laying the tracks. As the trip progressed, with each site that we went to, I got a better idea of what their lives were really like.
Well, as a non-Chinese, it still is important to find roots of all human beings. This is the way I feel. Whether you could be Indian, you could be black, you could be Asian, it doesn't matter. To find the roots of human beings is what I've gotten out of this trip. It doesn't matter. The group was varied, there's other people in it, and it's the feeling of humanity is what I feel when I go back. My enthusiasm is so great. I know right offhand how many more would like to come on this.